Rashid Omar, and I serve as the Imam of the Claremont Main Road Mosque in Cape Town. And I would like to bid you a hearty welcome to this webinar titled The Reflections on Violence, Looting, and Racist Vigilantism in Phoenix. It is now almost 6 weeks since the tragic events which took place in our beloved country in early July of 2021, in which over 340 fellow South Africans lost their lives, and it is estimated that our national economy lost 50 billion rands as a result of the torching of critical infrastructure and trucks and the gratuitous looting of shopping malls and businesses. By way of introduction, allow me to make 3 brief points. First, one of the abiding lessons that we should be learning from the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic is that our reverence, our respect, and our preservation of human life should supersede everything else. Second, as responsible South African citizens, we should hold our South African government accountable first and foremost for their failure in terms of the events that took place in July 2021. We should ask them to establish the circumstances that led to these events and that led to the death of each and every one of the over 340 human beings that lost their lives. And if there is credible evidence that there was incitement to violence and to destabilize the state, then it is the responsibility of government to arrest them and charge these individuals. But third, as civil society and as conscientious and responsible South African citizens, we also need to do some serious introspection as to the circumstances of the complex causes that led to the catastrophic events that beset our country during the month of July. And more importantly, what can we do to heal the huge divides within our society? Our webinar this evening is a modest attempt to convene a dialogue, a sharing of perspectives, and to embrace a call to action to exorcise our country from its many demons. We have assembled a stellar group of 4 panelists who will help us to facilitate this dialogue, this exchange of ideas and views with regard to the complex causes of the events, and also to help us to propose some modest steps for healing. We have 4 panelists, as I said: Rebecca Davis, who is an investigative journalist for the Daily Maverick, and Rebecca spent some time on the ground in Phoenix, so we are really keen to hear her findings. Sbu Zikodi, president of Abashlali, one of the largest shack dwellers collectives in South Africa, who has their roots, in fact, in KZN and in and around the area of Phoenix and Inanda. Dr. Imran Abbas, a political scientist from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a senior research associate of the OWAL Research Institute. And then, of course, finally, a good friend and long-standing comrade, Mrs. Ella Gandhi, a veteran anti-apartheid activist who served as a member of parliament from 1994 to 2004 as an ANC councillor, in fact, representing the communities of Phoenix and Inanda. Our format is as follows. We will ask each of the 4 panelists to make some introductory remarks for around 10 minutes, after which I will provide them an opportunity to respond to each other if they feel the need to do so. But more importantly, we would like to use the second part of our webinar to answer some questions from our Zoom participants. Now, the way in which this is going to work is we are strongly encouraging our Zoom participants to post your questions, send your questions in the chat. And I have invited 2 colleagues, Jamia Khalant and Aslam Fattar, who will be monitoring the chat for these questions. And they will select, synthesize the questions, and then I will provide them with an opportunity to pose the questions from the Zoom participants to our panelists and get our panelists to respond to them. So without further ado then, please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Rebecca Davis, to share her views and insights with us. Rebecca, I hope that you're able to hear us.
I am, thank you, Imam. Am I okay on the sound front?
You are.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just apologize in advance that I have a toddler who doesn't want to go to sleep. So if you hear some strange squeaks in the background, that is what is happening. And he's not being tortured, he's just naughty. Thank you so much for the invitation, Imam. The Claremont Main Road Mosque is, of course, an institution for which I have the deepest respect. And it's a real honor to be here on this panel with such esteemed speakers as well. So the honor is all mine. My remarks are going to be quite brief because I am acutely aware that I am an outsider to this context and that I absolutely do not have, and neither do I pretend to have, a deep understanding of the Phoenix context, or indeed even of the political currents in KwaZulu-Natal, particularly not compared with Dr. Buckus, for instance. Perhaps all I can really offer, in fact, is that independent lens. Certainly, I went to KwaZulu-Natal to try to investigate what happened without, I hope, having an axe to grind. I do consider myself to be a neutral observer in this situation, in as much as any of us are neutral observers. So together with my colleagues, Greg Nicholson and Becky Similane from the Daily Maverick, I set out to investigate what happened during the July unrest with 2 major questions in mind. The first was, how did 342 people come to die? This was a question that simply was not being answered by authorities. The only level of detail they were providing was to announce what number of deaths were being treated as murder dockets and what number of deaths were being treated as inquests, which obviously left a great deal of room for interpretation. Murdered by whom? And when it came to the hundreds of inquests, literally, how did all these people die? And it was bizarre to us that so many people, both within the media fraternity and the wider South African public, seemed so blasé about this volume of death that so many people seemed to accept that 342 people died without explanation. And I think there was a certain sense among some sectors of society that perhaps simply looters got what was coming to them. And while that is obviously hugely regrettable, a very, very cruel perspective, I do feel confident that most South Africans would not accept that the punishment for looting should be death, which is effectively what we're saying if we say that the looters deserved what they got. And hanging over it all, of course, was the shadow of Marikana. Although it was very, very different circumstances, we simply felt kind of duty bound to establish that it was not South Africa's security forces who had caused the deaths of hundreds of people, because unfortunately we know in this country that is not outside the realm of possibility. The second question we wanted to answer was specifically what happened in Phoenix. And that was because we had seen the references to a Phoenix massacre on social media, and it was already clear that this had the potential to be a very socially divisive issue. And there were also accusations that the media was deliberately turning a blind eye to the Phoenix massacre. So we wanted to establish one thing effectively, which was there a Phoenix massacre? Did such a thing happen? And here, of course, the question of how you define a massacre is highly open to debate. But I suppose to us, we were trying to establish whether there had been an unjustified and disproportionate use of force by one group towards another. And we can debate whether that does constitute a massacre, but perhaps this is one of those things that you know it when you see it, which is pretty much what a morgue employee would go on to tell us. So to be totally honest, I went into this reporting feeling skeptical about the possibility of a Phoenix massacre. And that was partly because some of the allegations were being spread by people whose livelihoods depend on fostering racial tensions. And by that, I mean, for instance, the leadership of the economic freedom fighters. Partly because some of the claims being made seemed so outlandish in their violence that they've strained credulity. There were claims that women were ripped out of cars and attacked, that cars were burnt with passengers inside, claims that men were run over twice by cars, that one man was slit in the chest so that his intestines spilled out. This level of violence seemed almost cartoonish in advance. At that stage, what we felt, rightly or wrongly, was that the perspectives that we needed on the situation most were from survivors of the violence, because at that stage, we noticed among our media colleagues a perhaps understandable attempt to create a moral equivalence here. So to say, yes, it is true perhaps that quite a lot of people died in Phoenix and that they seem mainly to have been Black, but on the other hand, that the Indian residents of Phoenix were under extraordinary stress, that they had a credible belief that their property or families would be harmed or destroyed, and that they acted in accordance with what they could do at the time, which was to protect themselves. The perspective that we received generally from and I'm sorry to use these crude racial terms, but they are the terms that are relevant to this discussion and the ones which the people we spoke to indeed used. The perspective we received from a lot of Indian people on the ground was effectively nobody attempted to justify the scale of the violence or the expressed happiness at the violence or people being killed, but there was a sense that what was done needed to be done at the time to protect the community. And this sentiment was perhaps most starkly expressed in Durban at the time when we were there a fortnight ago by a big billboard as you drive into Chatsworth, which was itself another scene of considerable violence. And the sign says, Pelican Pharmacy, which is a local pharmacy, thanks basically our heroes for protecting this community. So that has been the kind of narrative, I think, about what happened. As soon as we entered the township, which sits above Phoenix, we found basically household after household where largely young Black men had sustained injuries, largely at the hands of young Indian men. And it's impossible for me to go into detail, and neither would it be productive, I suspect, on all the cases we looked at. So I'm giving you broad brush strokes of the summary, and you're welcome to go and read the findings in more detail on the Daily Maverick. We found that there had been acts of brutality that are impossible to square with the narrative that people were just trying to protect property. That the claims made, for instance, about women being ripped out of cars, about cars being burnt with passengers inside, were valid. These things did happen, and they were confirmed to have happened even by the Minister of Police, Becky Cele, eventually. We recorded around 55 deaths linked to the unrest in Phoenix, of which, to be, again, callously and brutally kind of specific here, at least 50 were Black Africans and maybe 5 were Indian people. And complicating the situation is that the question of which geographical areas you include in Phoenix might be different depending on who you speak to, depending on what the authorities, because certainly our death toll of 55 deaths was higher by some margin. I think it was by about 15 deaths than the one that the authorities eventually have settled on. What we realized upon arriving in Phoenix was effectively that the layout of the suburb is such that Indian people tend to live close to the bottom of the suburb, if I can put it that way, because they're built up, and that Black people tend to live in townships that are built on the cliffs. So so to speak. And that Phoenix residents were taking it upon themselves to man the barricades leading into those suburbs. And they acting with disproportionate violence, because to travel to their homes during the unrest, Black people by necessity needed to pass through the barricades. But it was there that they were attacked, seemingly, as I say, by small groups of trigger-happy young men. We heard story after story of young men shot while they were walking, shot in cars, etc. We interviewed the family of a disabled man who was ripped from his car and beaten to death. His body was also covered in stab wounds. Some of the victims' families and some of the survivors did admit that they had been engaged in looting, but not within that suburb. So they were returning to the suburb with perhaps the spoils of the looting. But to claim, as I think has been done, that all this violence was necessary to protect property, I think falls apart if you look at the fact that very little appears to indeed have been looted in Phoenix and in Chatsworth. Either that's a sign of the success of the people manning the barricades, or, as we heard repeatedly, the fact that there was in fact no intent to loot in these areas. The dominant emotion, I think this is really the most important thing I want to say. The dominant emotion among survivors and among victims' families was of shock and betrayal and fear. They spoke of the fact that up until when was it, mid-July, Indian and Black people had been living in what they considered to be harmony in these areas, that they worked together, that they attended the same schools. One of the young men we spoke to who had been attacked knew his attackers intimately because they went to school together. He called out the window to them, "Damien, it's me, you know me." This is the extent to which these communities were actually integrated. So there was a real sense that this had been sprung upon them, this violence, from Indian people in a way that they did not expect and did not quite know how to respond to. And also a sense that perhaps that Indian people had been biding their time, and that perhaps that there had been a kind of racial tension underlying relations between the two groups all the time that simply was never dealt with. Most chillingly were the people who said that they were looking forward to the military leaving Phoenix because they hoped that they would be able to launch revenge attacks. And by that they meant revenge attacks against Indian people as a result of the violence that had been undertaken. I'm going to wrap up now just to give 3 further findings of our research in general, not perhaps related to Phoenix, but which I think helps the context. Important as well, we interviewed dozens and dozens of people in Gauteng and in KwaZulu-Natal. Nobody talked to us about former President Jacob Zuma. His involvement in this was limited to a few pieces of graffiti. So certainly it is the case that it was ordinary people caught up in this violence who were not ostensibly acting out of political motivations, whatever the motivation separately might have been of the instigators of this violence. In the end, we managed to establish some degree of information about how 109 deaths happened in that time period, which is frankly not very good. That's a third, less than a third of the total deaths, and it's still better, I think, than anyone else has managed to do. And of the cases where cause of death was able to be established, we established that at least 70% died as a result of being shot either by live ammunition or by rubber bullets, and the vast majority was not by police. So this really highlights the extent to which vigilantism and criminality became the order of the day, because I think also what a lot of people fail to understand is that many of the looters died simply by being attacked by other criminals, that they were trying to get home with their loot and were set upon by kind of ordinary habitual criminals. It is also undeniable that the police were highly ineffective. To hear Becky Taylor say this week that the police behaved beautifully was really just mind-boggling, because it is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the case that if police had been more effective, and that's not to say more brutal, it is to say more effective in their policing in this matter, lives, I think, could have been spared. That's all I think for now, Imam, so I'll pass back to you, but I'm happy to take any other questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was a good start to our discussion. Our next panelist that I'm going to invite is Sibusiso Innocent Zikodi, who is the president of Abahlali. You know, it also has a big constituency in and around the area of Phoenix and Inanda. Abahlali also made an urgent call during the you know the violence to build unity in KZN, to halt the incitement to racism and hate. And so please join me in welcoming Subu Zikodi to share his perspective with us.
Thank you so much, Imam, and greetings to my fellow panelists here and everyone that is participating. Thank you for this wonderful invite at the time where it is most needed, that we have an honest dialogue to really face the realities that our society confronts. I would like to, first of all, extend my deepest condolences to all the families. We are told 351, 355, 342, but our deepest condolences to those families. And I must be very careful, and I have been warned that we must be very careful how we address this issue in terms of its sensitivity that it carries. So I think it's fair to pass those condolences and to say that it is the most unfortunate scenes that we have seen in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, and it has brought shame to us and to many of us who have deep love and value humanity. That this is what we are committed to. It has brought shame. Given to our experiences of what has happened, obviously working in and around Phoenix, I must say that we have families living in Phoenix. We have kids going to schools in Phoenix, and around the area, Bambai, we have relatives without necessarily having the presence of Abahlali as a movement in that area. And also we do work with Phoenix ratepayers and tenants association, PRA in Phoenix. So we are sharing a number of values with the residents of Phoenix. It is for that reason I'm saying it is very unfortunate to have experienced what we've gone through. And of course, it is important to say that we have been warning as Abahlali that the anger of the poor can go in many directions. It can take different forms. And unfortunately, one of the forms it has taken right now is what we have seen, and it is most unfortunate. And of course, the level of poverty, inequalities that continues to exist in our society is one of the reasons why we have come to the point that we are facing today. And of course, unemployment and so on. Also, opportunism that was provided by these situation that came out from the 11th of July, 12th of July, and all that week. So what we can say as Abahlali is that we have been warned that we must be careful on how we narrate this issue, because you are seen as betraying, the reality. So I just want to make viewers and everyone aware that it has become almost difficult to even open your mouth discussing this issue because it's a reality. So I'm not going to attempt to do any investigations or finding of any sort. I'm so happy that Rebecca has come before me, people who have the capacity and expertise to do some kind of investigation. But also I do want to leave the investigation to the police and the justice system to take its course. All I can say as Abahlali on behalf of the movement is that we call on for law enforcement agencies to do their thorough investigation and leave no stone unturned as to what has led to these kind of killing of people. And what is disturbing while speaking about having to have confidence again in the police is that the police decided not to act. This is what we have seen. Police volunteered to watch, and for us, they have to tell South Africa why they have chosen not to act, not to protect lives, which then gave this opportunity for vigilante groups and groups of criminals to actually use this opportunity. So I think police have so much to tell South Africa and to account for their decisions not to act, not to protect lives, and people were forced, to do something about their situation. And of course, we are living in a country where we are told that it is not a banana republic. We hear quite often politicians saying that. But on that day, there was no law. There were no institutions. It was vacant in leadership. We have not seen leadership also providing clean and clear leadership at that point. So these were really disturbing moments that we have seen. So it is important also to say people are living in deep poverty. And we've alluded on the question of the frustration and anger that many people, particularly in the shack settlements, are facing in this country without any hope. And nobody's giving hope to these communities who are actually living in this deep poverty. And of course, many of the lootings that we have seen was just as a result of this desperation, other than the hidden political agenda that the factions of the ruling party are still, using, the blame game that we are seeing. But we know that South Africans are clear on what is happening. I think what will help us as a society, to confront the issues of race, not only in Phoenix, Chatsworth, in anywhere in South Africa, is that we need to have an honest conversations about, who we are as human beings. I think that is important, which is partly why it is important for the work that Abahlali does within our popular education program to make sure that ubuhlali and valuing of human life becomes so important. This is our message today, that it is high time that we use our schools, we use our trade unions, those that are in labor movement, those that are in civil society, to actually educate and preach peace, because this is what is needed at this time. And we want to call for calm. And we are saying there are practical steps that can actually be done to minimize these kinds of tensions, but also social ills that we witness every day in our society. So because this may not be the last time that it occurs, it can still come and manifest itself in different forms. Given the frustrations that people are having, given the level of poverty and little opportunities and hopes that people have. So leaders have the responsibility, therefore, to talk to our members, to talk to our communities about the needs to build peace, unity, and solidarity, but to be able to value human life, because what we have learned in this particular instance is that there has been so much a gesture of valuing property over human life. We have seen people doing all they can, going out to make sure that the property is protected, not in the same way of protecting human life. This is what we've been worried about for many years as Abahlali. Our movement has lost 18 activists, and the society, the middle class and publics have been silenced about this. And it has become normal that you can kill poor people, particularly Black people, with impunity. We have seen this state teaching us violence, being violence to communities that are already vulnerable, that are already poor. So you cannot rule in violence and teach people violence and expect something else. So we are reaping what we are sowing as a country, as a society. So it is high time, therefore, that we begin to value human life, we begin to respect even those people that we look down upon, people that we see as if they are beneath the law, because this is what we are treated, as if we are beneath the law. It is high time that we should learn how to share, value and appreciate each other, as South Africans, irrespective of our race, religion, and all other divisive, names that we give ourselves. So what we are calling for this evening is that those who are living in deep poverty, it cannot be business as usual. Those who have something, at least something, they must learn to share. Because if you are at peace because you are living comfortably and expect those who are less privileged, who are marginalized, to continue living in such deep poverty, it cannot be business as usual. And we are saying, therefore, the state has to play its duty. The police have to play its duty. And we are saying there needs to be a call for calm and peace. We all need to work towards contributing to peace building projects in various ways, in our own legally confined corner, whether in your neighborhood, whether in your families. It's time to begin the language of peace, unity, and solidarity. It just cannot be business as usual when some people live high life, when some people are struggling to get a plate on the table. So there needs to be a dialogue in each city, in each neighborhood, in each province about what needs to be done to build peace, unity, and solidarity that will take us forward as a country. And of course, it is high time that the question of land is addressed in this country. There needs to be rapid release of land, not just for housing, but to be able to allow communities to have farming so that they can have food without really relying on the retail and on those big markets that would require money that we do not have. But the state needs to take seriously and urgent steps to create jobs. These are some of the practical ways and the reality. We cannot live on handout as a society. Yes, grants are important and necessary and urgent at this time, such as your basic income grant. We are calling for that because people just cannot live without jobs, without means. So as long as people remain unemployed, in poverty, without any state assistance, violence is inevitable. And of course, the COVID-19 relief grant, which has been returned, which we appreciate, but we are saying it is not enough. Cost of food has gone high outside. The fuel and the services such as your water, electricity, have been increased, and therefore it is important that therefore the state consider what we call a charter, to add a little bit so that people can be able to have food on the table. So moving forward, let's build an inclusive economy. An inclusive economy is an economy that will include those neighborhoods that have been sidelined for too long. And even if they do not have shares in those companies and so on. But there needs to be a serious conversation so that when situation of this nature comes, people can be able to acknowledge and appreciate that those properties are for them. They can swiftly move to defend the properties because they have a stake on those property. And I think business people need to learn to share and not just accumulate profits. So we want to appreciate also those whom were affected by looting. Some of the business communities we have seen, they have suffered so much. But at the time of great needs, it was the same people who were the victims of looting who were actually giving out bread and milk to the various people who were actually part of the looting, but also who are starving. So we must appreciate that. And this is what we call the spirit of Ubuntu. So I want to end my contribution by saying it is high time that we return the importance and what most South Africans and generally African believes in the spirit of Ubuntu. And we must say, umuntu ungumuntu ngabantu, meaning a person is a person and is defined in relation to others. And your humanity is not complete in isolation to others. Let us embrace and appreciate and value our humanity. This is what we stand for. This is what we commit ourselves to. I want to invite everyone tonight to join us as we work to humanize the world a little better. The Phoenix story must be left to the police to do their honest investigation and tell South Africa what has led to this situation and apologize to those who have lost their loved ones. But we cannot continue playing the blame game. It will take us nowhere. We need to take responsibility and make sure that a situation of this nature does not return again. So if Abahlali have popular education that are about Ubuntu and creating unity, solidarity between and within struggling communities, this is what I call everyone to do in their little corners. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Sbu Zikodi, President of Abahlali, for your thoughtful reflections and for your frank sharing of your viewpoint. I hope that your invitation at the end will be accepted by many of us here this evening. We now move on to our third panelist. Dr. Imran Abbas is a senior research associate at the Awal Socio-Economic Research Institute. Imran is also a research fellow in the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he also serves as the editor of the Durban-based newspaper Al Qalam. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Imran Abbas to share his views with us.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. I want to thank Imam Rashid and the Claremont Main Road Mosque for inviting me. It's an institution close to my heart, so when Imam Rashid and Aslam Fattar asked me to come on the panel tonight, I think I had very little chance of saying no. But I'm also glad I did, because I'm joined by panelists like Sbu Zikodi and Ila Gandhi, whom I've worked and collaborated with for the last 2 decades or so. And by Rebecca Davis from the Daily Maverick, also an institution close to my heart because I write a column for them. I'm going to try not to kind of surface points that were made already by Rebecca and Sbu, and maybe just offer a few pedestrian comments of my own. I think at the outset, just to say that the enormity of the chaos and the violence that gripped Durban and other towns on those few days in July are still sinking in. When someone suggested to me earlier today, what is the need for a panel like this? Have these points not been ventilated adequately already? I would say that there's a need for these conversations to be repeated multiple times because there are just so many aspects of it that are not clear. But I think what we do know already after some weeks of digesting the velocity of the information that was coming in the early days is we know that this unrest was triggered in the early part by small groups of really well-organized pro-Zuma forces acting largely from within the African National Congress. Of course, that later on had multiple other currents of political manipulation, of some of the toxicity we've seen in places like Phoenix, etc. We also know that in the early part, some have come to refer to it as the bread riots over the first 2 days or so. But maybe just to rewind a little and say that, one of the things I've reflected on previously is that this entire project around Zuma, and the point I'm making really is that, the early stages of this was mobilized by forces from within the so-called Zuma faction. That the entire initial stages of Jacob Zuma were never just about kleptocracy, There's always been an anti-democratic element in the Zuma faction. And we've seen political capture, we've seen the redirection of significant parts of the intelligence services, of the police. We've also seen that while Zuma was in office, there were clear connections to the underworld. And people like Sbu Zikodi might be better placed to also tell us about the ongoing attacks that we saw in places like Durban during the reign of Jacob Zuma. And well prior to the unfortunate events of July, I've also argued previously that the attacks we've seen on the N3 since about 2017, 2018 were organized in a really militarized way. And we also know that people claiming to be former MK people, rogue elements in the intelligence service, etc., have all been a part of it. And well prior to what we saw in July, we also know that we saw attacks on migrants in Durban on several occasions. And then too, people who were claiming to be part of MK and MK veterans, perhaps trying to win popular support, were also involved in this. So there is, a history that one needs to trace when one talks about the Zuma forces being involved in this, particularly in the early stages. And like Rebecca alluded to, we don't know yet how the bulk of the people who died lost their lives, or exactly how widespread some of the kind of impact of the violence was. But we can draw some conclusions. We do know in large part that when you live in a country as ours, as unequal as ours, with the levels of unemployment, hunger, and general deprivation that's not sustainable and that's not addressed, the kind of social explosion we saw, perhaps to some extent has its roots in that. And it's not to suggest that another social explosion will not occur in the future. We have in a country like ours, and if one looks at the literature and one looks at our social strata, large masses of people are unemployed and desperately poor at the base of our social strata. The top has historically been white. The top of our apex, we are seeing a middle class explosion with huge levels of social mobility, but the bottom remains really volatile, right? And even the levels of deracialization we see in a context like ours occurs very largely at the apex of our social strata. So the kind of really fluent sociality that we see in Camps Bay and in Umhlanga and in Sandton that occurs at the top comes as no surprise. But what's also happening at the bottom is that there's a level of re-racialization that's been brewing for a long time. So in working class communities, we've had levels of re-racialization brewing for a long, long time. But we've also had in communities like Phoenix, we've had Black and Indian people cohere, we've had Black and Indian people work together, struggle together, right? And of course, what happened in July may have seriously impacted on that sociality that was starting to build at the base of our social strata. In some of my more recent writings, I've made the point that there's a significant chunk of the ANC, particularly in KZN, and together with their associated tenderpreneurs in the province, that if one uses the political lens, have shown a willingness for a long time to engage in violence. And I would even provocatively suggest treason, looking at the events that we've seen in recent times. I've also written about how we need to go forward with the swift arrest and prosecution of many of those who were organized in the campaign, who had organized the campaign, as well, of course, of those who were responsible for the vigilante killings. And I think in a province like KZN, I do follow KZN politics pretty closely, or try to, and I would suggest that there is a need for a clean out of the provincial ANC. I think there's a need for large-scale expulsion from the top to the bottom of anyone who was shown to have been supportive of the attacks, the attacks on the infrastructure or the unrest that we've seen. And the third point that I've made previously is this need for a massive program of social support. Locating that in the context of what I was saying about the levels of inequality in our country. But I think the one thing that we also need to celebrate while we talk about all this is when we think about the July crisis, and I'm hoping we have people in the session today from the Phoenix Residents and Tenants Association. I think we do. I think the leadership displayed by them, the leadership displayed by grassroots organizations led by people like Sbusi Kode and Abahlali Basim Jondole broadly, coming together, cohering, a large part, in my own view, of the race war in the early days was on Twitter and on social media. But I think on the ground, there were huge efforts being made. There were provocative statements and, seemingly progressive statements coming from people from outside of KZN and from all over, trying to spark a race war and trying to talk about this race war. But I think those on the ground, we're really doing a great deal of work to ensure that we cohere. So just to reiterate some of the points, I think there have already been a number of arrests of, in relation to the murders in Phoenix. A few people who've also made inflammatory statements on social media, etc. However, one of the glaring points for me, again, perhaps provocatively, is there doesn't seem to be any systematic process of investigating and arresting people who are linked to ANC structures in the province, who in large part were responsible for organizing, the campaign of sabotage. And I think that's a cause for serious, serious concern. People are starting to ask if the state is preferring to focus on poor people who are not able to produce the receipts for the food that they may have taken. That comes as no surprise, people taking food. I think if we kind of eject ourselves from the comfort of our middle class lenses, then we might perhaps be able to better understand, the looting of food. But there seems to be a huge focus on getting people to show receipts for the food and those sorts of things. But there isn't a serious attempt at looking at forces within the ANC that were responsible. Some are even arguing that with the ANC in KZN divided from top to bottom, and the Ramaphosa faction perhaps feels that acting against people in the ANC who engaged in the sort of treason that we saw might be politically risky. Right? We know how the balance of forces in the African National Congress worked. But I think all of this is really worrying. If the state can't identify and arrest people who were burning the trucks, warehouses, and malls, and some of the allegations of things like substations, etc., then we can be seen to be granting impunity for those people. And again, the point that's already made, and this is really, really worrying, we seem to focus a great deal on Phoenix, but we also know that we don't know how the bulk of people who lost their lives during the riots and sabotage died. We're really far, far from knowing that. The state has given us really detailed information about Phoenix, but has largely been silent on the rest of the hundreds of deaths. I know Rebecca did a good job with all her investigations, giving us the numbers, 342 or 350 that Spoo may have suggested, 55 from Phoenix. And I think Rebecca also alluded to the figure of, more or less establishing how 109 deaths occurred. But that leaves us with about 200 and 250 deaths that we don't know about, that perhaps have nothing to do with Phoenix, right? And there isn't a focus about that, but there remains a focus on Phoenix. Again, one may start to ask, why is the state not focusing on trying to establish how the rest of the hundreds of people died? Why are people in really influential positions not asking that question, but really focusing on, what is it, the 50 or so in Phoenix? You know, is there a role of the state in the killings that we've seen? And I think without any clear information, rumors will proliferate. And it's vital that I think that the public is given a detailed account of what's happened. What happened in July was a historical turning point, and we're fortunate to have someone like Ila Gandhi also on the panel, someone who lived through 49, 85, and 2021. None of us can really have that kind of broad level understanding of these things, but I think the patience of the poor, won't be permanent, and I think that the sort of kleptocratic faction of the ANC that's been willing to engage in the destruction, that's had huge economic loss, social cost, etc. We need to start focusing on that. We should also be welcoming the extension of the COVID grant in the wake of the riots. I think it's some kind of acknowledgement that there needs to be this commitment to interclass social solidarity. Those of us in KZN and those of us who have, our roots also in the base of the social strata understand the need for this interclass solidarity that needs to be built. And the state, I would think, really needs to come clean with us and needs to answer, in conclusion, I would say, two really urgent questions that in my view. One is exactly how did all of the people die in the riots? A simple pedestrian question. And two, why is there no action against the people that organized the campaign of sabotage in the midst of the riots? This focus on people having receipts for their food is something that we might need to go well beyond if we are to make any progress. So thanks, Imam. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Imran Abbas, for this insightful view. I just want to remind our Zoom participants again about the chat. Please feel free, and I'm seeing lots of discussion there, which is wonderful, to post your questions there. We have Jamia Khalant and Aslam Fatal who are monitoring the questions, who will select them and will synthesize them and pose them to our participants in the next session. So please make use of the chat, and thank you very much. Our last and final of our panelists is a very good friend and colleague, Ella Gandhi. Ella served as a member of the South African Parliament from 1994 to 2004 and a veteran anti-apartheid activist. But Ella also combines two wonderful things. A vision that we all have for peace, but peace with justice, which is wonderful. Ella, I'm looking forward to your remarks, especially in terms of your wisdom in helping us look towards the future of what could be done in terms of healing. So please join me in welcoming Mrs. Ella Gandhi.
Thank you so much, and greetings to all of you. I'm just going to make two comments before I go into looking at the future, as you have indicated. The first comment is, as Imran, and I think Rebecca and Sbu said, that, there was a deliberate and a planned effort in this. And you can see it in the pattern. The roads were first barricaded through the attacks on the trucks. Then you had the shops that were, opened up by somebody. We don't know, a group went and opened up the shops and then mobilized the poor people to come and take the goods. And I won't call them looters because I live in a high-rise building, And I saw people walking at ease without any fear. You know, if you were a thief, you take the thing and you run. But here were people who were taking things in trolleys and taking an easy walk up the hill. So there was impunity. They knew that they are not going to be arrested or anything is going to happen to them. And that assurance must have been given by somebody to them, because this is what I saw. I witnessed it with my own eyes, that people were just walking. At the beginning, there were young people who were taking things, and after them, another group came, and these were elderly women with children who went and took things from the shop, and they were going. It looked like the first group were taking beers and the second group were taking groceries. So, you know, word must have gone around that you get free groceries over here, just go and get it. And this is what happened. So they were not looting as such. They just went and they got the stuff which they needed. So that's the first observation. It was a planned, well-planned insurrection. And, you know, when the focus moved from the, you know, attacks on these shops and things to the so-called looters or people who were taking the goods, the attention of the public was drawn to that. And what we found is that there were neighborhood watches everywhere. In the city, there were, in my neighborhood, there were neighborhood watches. So it wasn't only Phoenix that had neighborhood watches. And most of them were really neighborhood watches who were looking after their families and so on. Even in Phoenix, most of the people were just doing that. They weren't there to attack anybody. But amongst them were some vigilantes, some elements who had crime on their mind and who went to the extreme, which caused the deaths and the beatings of people. And I heard their stories and it was terrible. And I think that we cannot but condemn those people who did that. Amongst them, according to the stories, were also people who belonged to security agencies, security companies, and they attacked some of the people. So, you know, that's the observation that I make. But after that, they went and they bombed factories. They bombed warehouses. There was no looting in the warehouses and the factories. When they opened up the malls and the shops, people went there and took things. But why were the factories and warehouses burnt? And amongst them was a warehouse, a chemical factory. And that has done so much of damage to the environment that those people who did that must be brought to book, because that was a really highly criminal act to do that. It doesn't only harm the people that you see now. It says that, you know, even those mothers who might have, you know, taken in those fumes could have deformed babies in the future. We don't know. And those are some of we saw the fishes that were lying on the shores in Umhlanga and other places. So look at the damage that they've done. Now, coming to what was the after effect of this. And I am really happy to say that I've never seen grassroots communities coming together like they have now. There is a beautiful unity amongst the people. There is a will to establish peace. There is people are working. They are doing work day and night in order to bring about peace, unity amongst the communities, helping the communities. I mean, food parcels are being given out every day. I didn't ask for shoes, but a company decided to give shoes to Phoenix Settlement, and we distributed them. And the people were very happy in this winter to have something to wear on their feet. The people especially who were running around bare feet. Now they've got shoes to wear. So those were some of the good things that have come out of this. And, religious community, interfaith groups have come together. You find Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and others coming together, Jewish people, all coming together to help. So that is the beauty, and that is what we need to build on. Because going forward, South Africa will only come out of the situation that we are in if the people are united and work together and look after each other, so that we can really build that community spirit amongst all of us. Not to say Phoenix is separate and Bombay is separate or anything like that. All of us coming together, working together as one across religion, race, class, and everything. And that is possible because we are seeing it now. So that's the good part of the whole story. And they always say there's a silver lining behind every cloud. So this is the silver lining. And I ask all of you to help us build that. Do it in your neighborhoods. Take the opportunity now to start building that spirit in all your neighborhoods. And we as a community will be able to put South Africa right. Don't wait for the government. They're not going to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ella, and thank you for your wise words of advice. Whilst we have focused on Phoenix, this is a challenge for all of us, even in the Western Cape. There is huge structural violence and there is huge tensions. And the same thing that happened in Phoenix and elsewhere in the country might well happen in the Western Cape. We're sitting on a powder keg, and if we don't work even harder to cross the racial and other divides in our societies, it can easily be used and abused by instigators and agent provocateurs to stir up all kinds of nefarious agendas. So thank you very much to all of our participants. Thank you for your thoughtful reflections. I am now going to offer the panelists an opportunity, if you feel the need to do so, to make some responses to each other before we go to the questions. I'm not going to be giving too much of time for this because we've got a healthy amount of comments and questions coming through in the chat. So please, floor is open. Is there anyone? You can just raise your hand and then, or you can unmute yourself. Rebecca, Sbu.
Yeah, I just had a few points to make, Imam, if that's all right.
Yes, go ahead.
So just because there seems to be some rightly curiosity about this question of how did people die, perhaps I should have given a bit more information because there is more information that we do have at this point. I think that there is a legit reason why authorities have not given very much information, and that legitimate reason is that looting is chaotic and that people die in many extraordinarily different ways that you might not even have considered. So for instance, we looked in our reporting at the case of a single macro in Pietermaritzburg that was based in the, what's it called, Kampstrift or something, someone would know, Kampstrift. It's an office park out in Pietermaritzburg that looters descended on en masse because it had a macro, it had an SAB So there was alcohol and there were electronic goods. There was everything, basically frozen meat as well. In that macro, we believe that around 20 people died, possibly more. And the ways they died in are extraordinarily diverse. For instance, people were stealing alcohol and drinking it on the spot. And when soldiers arrived to try and disperse the looters, people ran in all directions. Some of them ran into the road and were killed by traffic. Others jumped into a river opposite the Campstrift Park and drowned. Others were trying to use a forklift truck to lift alcohol off the shelves, but not being able to do so, they knocked heavy boxes of alcohol onto looters and killed them. Other looters that we heard of were killed by heavy blocks of meat falling on their heads. This issue of people running into traffic also seems to have been a major source of death. So just to say that really, honestly, there were many, many ways that people did die. I don't think that there is necessarily a conspiracy around a lot of this. I think a lot of it is a genuine difficulty in ascertaining at such a scale how everyone did die. And I think the legitimate reason to focus on Phoenix and to some degree on Chatsworth too, which we haven't spoken about, but Chatsworth was also the scene of, I mean, authorities themselves say between something like 13 and 30 people dying in Chatsworth violence. The reason to focus on them is because as far as we've been able to establish, and I think this is true, there is not a site in South Africa that saw deaths at such a volume from the hand, through man-made causes, through killing, through murdering, than we saw at Phoenix and Chatsworth. And for the person in the comments who's suggesting there was a conspiracy about the Ndofire Mall in Meadowlands, I visited that mall. And I saw clearly what happened, and that was a stampede. 11 people died. So also, let's not jump to conspiracy when often, I mean, this is an old saying, but don't jump to conspiracy when sometimes incompetent.
Is there anyone?
Yes, I can just jump in, Imam. Just to say that some of us on the grounds were actually receiving text messages. Yeah. I was just saying some of us on the grounds were actually receiving text messages, from WhatsApp groups from the members of the ANC were actually part of having a conversation amongst themselves to a point that they were actually saying, comrades should not wear parties t-shirts because this would then they would be easily identified. So sitting with some of this sensitive information that you do not know who to take it to. I attempted to phone the Premier, for instance, and we end up not knowing who to trust when the police act. From what Mama Gandhi was saying, it was very clear this was not really looting as such. People were just taking and were given assurance that they were not going to be arrested for what they were doing. So there seems to be an instruction that came from higher authority that you do as you please. This is what we've seen. Some of the information that could really help the police to face, because these messages have numbers of the people who are circulating and having a conversations amongst themselves and saying, don't just loot that one, set the fire on that one. So why are we sitting with such information and nobody's prepared to take it for a serious investigation as to what transpired? This is the area of serious concerns.
Thank you, Sbu. Imran and Ella, do you feel the need to make some responses before we go to the questions?
Yeah, just maybe something really quick. Imam, just a quick question maybe to Rebecca. That was really interesting information, Rebecca, that people drowning and taking stuff and all of that. But why are we not told about this? Is there a reason that there isn't an effort to let people know?
Honestly, I think some of it might be to do with sensitivities towards the deceased. I know that there is often a kind of over-sensitivity, if anything, I think, towards causes of death. And I think the other reason is, I don't want to say incompetence, but just the shambles of those few days. We heard that conditions in morgues, for instance, were truly inhuman, which is a weird thing to say about the dead, but that bodies were coming in, they were just being thrown on top of each other. So I would also imagine that in some cases, the causes of death might even have been wrongly prescribed or unprescribed at all. That's all I can think of.
Okay. Ella?
Thanks.
Yeah, I think just one other comment that I would like to make, and one perhaps a challenge to Imran and Rebecca and maybe Sbu as well. I'm not sure if you guys know that in the old days, there used to be, Rashid, you might recall, there was such a thing as kids constables who, created such havoc in places like Pietermaritzburg, where people were killed in numbers. I don't know if you recall that during the UDF days. And at that time, when in 82, from the 80s to around, 89, these people used to come in and create those problems. Now, what I would like to ask is what happened to them? Are they still in the force? And are they still causing some problems for all of us? We need to know where they are. And for anyone who does research, I think find out where those guys are, because they were hardened. They were asked to do these things, and some of the crimes they committed were just terrible. You see, if you read the records of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you'll see that. But they didn't, the ones who committed this didn't go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as far as I know. So that's the one point. The second point is that there is definitely a concerted effort to racialize the whole thing. Not at the beginning. At the beginning, they just wanted to destabilize the country by doing these things, attacking these specific shops and areas and so on. Then they found that that plan wasn't quite working, and they decided to racialize. This is my perception. And I believe that there's definitely a collusion, maybe some media houses who started the story about the Phoenix massacre, and maybe some people who started the story about Phoenix being racist. Now, I can't see how you can define a whole, community, 400,000, 500,000 people who live in Phoenix, being racist because some people in that area committed. We don't even know if the people who committed those murders were actually from the area. As I said, it was said that some of those murders were committed by security companies. Now, do those people live in that area, or are they from outside? We don't know. And in any case, even if they do, and even if there are about 50 people who were racist, it doesn't mean that the 400,000 who lived there are racist. Because I've heard stories from people who told me that they were assisted. When they were injured, they were assisted by the Indian people who took them to the doctors to be treated. So, there are all kinds of people in all kinds of communities. Sorry,
Thank you.
Thanks for
you very
taking
much,
too
Ella.
long.
And as we can glean from our discussion, there's a wide perspective of views, and that's why conversations like this needs to happen all the time, so that we can hear empathetically the other and be open to challenge ideas with better ideas. So without further ado, then I'm going to, and thank you for our participants for their patience and their wonderful way in which they are engaging the chat. I'm going to ask Aslam Fattar if you wouldn't mind to unmute yourself and to give us a sense of the kinds of questions that are emerging in the chat, and maybe you might want to identify one or all of the participants to briefly just respond to some of those questions. Aslam, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much, Imam Rashid. Good evening, colleagues and comrades. I have watched the comments come up on the chat. There have been about 50 of them, which is wonderful. I just wanted to say from myself and Jamia that this webinar is turning out to be much more incisive than what we imagined. There are about 100 people on the webinar, so that is important. The webinar recording will be on Facebook and on the mosque channel, and I think we should make it widely available. If there's any hesitation, if there was any hesitation about whether we should be having these conversations, the way the conversation's gone tonight indicates that we've answered that in the affirmative. Imam Rashid, I'm going to just list 6 areas quickly. Then Jamia is going to add to my areas, right? 6 quickly. Jamia is going to add to my, I'm going to try to pose them as questions and then invite the panelists to respond to any of the 6 or one or more of the 6 questions. The first question that emerges right through the to the webinar as well as on the conversation chat is the question about understanding the structural factors that underpin the violence and the crisis in Durban and in fact in Gauteng, and also how they may pertain to similar communities in the rest of Cape Town. Questions of poverty, unemployment, and sort of the kind of the neoliberalization of our society, and what kind of critique we have to bring to that, and what kind of politics we have to bring to correct some of these things. So the first question is around addressing the neoliberal impacts with regard to structural constraints, out of which lays the basis and out of which this violence emerged. That's the first question. I'm going to be a bit incoherent. The second question relates to the government, the state, the ANC's impunity, and whether this impunity is the result of a conflation of government, state, and party, and whether it's time that we expose this conflation, the conflation of state to government to party, and how elements of kleptocracy have over time infiltrated the state and laid the political basis for what has emerged. And then how to put it to a point, how the RET forces had hijacked government and state activity to have led to this. And how, importantly, we have to keep the state, the government, and the political party accountable. The second point is the big question, and I'm only going to pose it: what really happened on the ground, right? With regard to looting, which definition we want to use of it, that's up for grab. With regard to violence, with regard to recrimination, with regard to home invasions, potentially if that happened, with regard to attacks of incrimination against particular people, Black African people particularly, and particularly with regard to who attacked and on what basis they attacked. And very importantly, something that came out in sideways here was the role of social media in fanning the flames, in mobilizing, in instigating, and in acting that kind of fake space, that fake mobilizational space, and how that was mobilized in this process. The fourth issue is the issue of police culpability. And also, someone asked police preparedness. That is the question that Ella Gandhi asked at the end about whether police were firstly culpable or set up to behave in a particular way, and very importantly, whether they were actually prepared to address the situation that they were confronted. But also, with regard to security, what is the role of the privatization of security in our communities, in our suburbs, in our towns? The role of vigilantism, criminal gangster activity, that all becomes part of the securitization mix that leads to the kind of deathly responses that have come out in India. There were questions about, are these killings being investigated? Are they bringing, to what extent are they bringing to court? And so on and so forth. Rashid, I'm almost done. 2 more issues is the whole issue of race relations. In Phoenix, in Chatsworth, and in communities all over the country. And that is, to what extent are ethnic, class, religious, sexual, gender categories being mobilized to set people up, to set people upon each other along these lines? How are we doing with regard to these kinds of issues? And very importantly, someone asked, when groups of people who organize along ethnic lines or race or racial lines are culpable, how do we hold them account for their racist actions and so on? The last point is the whole point about strategies to address social cohesion. So right throughout the chat, everyone was very concerned, not just with understanding the complexity of what happened, but also with how to recover a sense of the sign of social cohesive activity that we can engage in that space. So there were many comments about that. The University of KwaZulu-Natal, someone from there indicated that they are stepping up to get a person involved. I think Imran made one very important point, and that is that outsiders were potentially not understanding the issue and potentially sending in messages that could have gotten the analysis of the issue wrong. But what he said in counter to that was that local communities in Phoenix and particularly were beginning to make very important alliances with respect to how to address this issue. I'm now handing over to Jamia to add to that and then hand over to the speakers. Thank you, Rashid.
Shukran, Aslam, and salam, everyone. I think the only thing, Aslam, I'd want to add to what you've said is that in the last point, with respect to strategies for social cohesion, I think that there were some very explicit questions or comments about either the potential for building an anti-racism program and what might that entail. Where do we even begin to build such a program or a movement? So otherwise, I think you covered all of the categories of questions. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Jamia and Aslam, for synthesizing the questions which have come through from our patient and wonderful Zoom participants. I'm now going to ask our panelists. You don't need to answer, all of these questions. You may just want to home in on one or two or more of them in, making some concluding remarks. So I think I'm going to ask, start again with Rebecca and then move along the same, sequence as we had in the speakers. Rebecca, you would like to respond?
Imam, I feel I'm just duty bound to respond to what Mrs. Gandhi said in the last round, which is that she seemed to suggest that a media narrative was responsible for the creation of a false Phoenix massacre idea. And with respect, I mean, I just have to say, I think that's wrong. As a journalist who was reporting from the scene, I found evidence to support the idea of a Phoenix massacre, which is what I was trying to lay out earlier. And I think that one of the issues we're running up against here, and I can see it coming through in the comment section too, is a lot of defensiveness about that particular idea. And I understand why it's abhorrent, but I think particularly in this world where fake news and misinformation, we have to trust what facts we can, and the facts support that what happened in Phoenix was to some degree a massacre. And that is for the people of Phoenix now to painfully, I'm sure, work through and resolve. But I don't think ongoing defensiveness is perhaps the best way to approach it. Thanks.
Yes, I just want to respond on the question of impunity, whether from the state or from the party. It is really concerning to many of us. For a very long time, we've seen this culture of impunity taking place. In our case, in our own day-to-day experiences, we've seen this culture of impunity and seeing the state becoming law unto themselves. Politicians do as they please, as if our law do not exist, and which is why our conclusion was to say, poor people are beneath the law. We are treated as if we are really beneath the law. So, and for trying to expose these corrupt politicians who refuse to account I think part of what has happened has been the ability of the RET forces to hijack the state. We've seen this during the reign of the former president. Even the rate of violence and killing within activists and social movement has been extremely high. And the worrying factor about this is the silence of public, the silence of civil society, the silence of middle-class people who will accept this as normal. So we are normalizing, we are participating in normalizing the culture of impunity. It is high time that South Africans in general, at least from below, hold government accountable. And we should not allow them to subvert the law and to be the law unto themselves. This is what we have seen. We have seen politicians violating the rule of law. This is not the first time what we're experiencing with the former president. We've been to courts on a number of occasions, and whether the land invasion unity or red ants or your law enforcement in Cape Town, they have become law unto themselves, and it has become normal. Your silence as communities, your silence as middle-class communities in these irresponsible acts act negative, or rather create the situation that we find ourselves in. It's high time to say what is wrong, no matter who does the wrong thing. It needs to be confronted and be given a name.
Thank you, Sbu. Imran?
Yeah, just one or two quick points. I think Aslam hit the nail on the head talking about the structural factors, and that's perhaps worthy of comment. Clearly there are neoliberal constraints, and I think we need to think about how post-apartheid politics work and how a post-colonial context works, right? The politics of our context are highly contested. And we know in a context like South Africa, our politics are contested by the market. And that's been a reality, for a large part of the post-apartheid context. So we also know that the structural crisis that we had really led to the food crisis and what happened. With the levels of unemployment we have in South Africa, even larger than during the Great Depression of the 30s, comparable, through the great work of publications like the New Frame, comparable to Gaza today are the levels of unemployment in South Africa, particularly youth unemployment. So I think when you have factors like that, it really heightens these structural factors and giving rise to the kind of crisis that we saw. I think the other question that's perhaps worthy to comment on is the question of race tensions, right? And I think I spoke earlier on about how there have been a level of re-racialization, but also levels of de-racialization at the base and in communities like Phoenix. And I think people from Phoenix on the panel might be better placed to talk about that. But perhaps another important question to ask is, what's the political utility of escalating the racial tensions for the Zuma faction? And I think that's something perhaps worth looking at. And I think in that context, if we think about the fact that if Black people generally are aligned against Indians, and there's unity amongst Black people in that context, and Zuma is a part of it, then that lends a particular political capital in the balance of forces of our politics. And I'm not going to comment on the impunity part because I think Spu has already. So I'll stop there. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Imran. Ella?
Okay, I think that, in one of our meetings with the South African Council of Churches, KZN Council of Churches, rather, not South African, we talked about the experience that people in Rwanda had. And what happened there? People, Hutus and Tutsis, were living as neighbors. They were friends. They went to the same school. But one day, something happened and they turned against each other. And that can easily happen in our country. And so we really need to work together to ensure that that sort of thing doesn't happen. And that can only happen from grassroots level. And it can only happen if it's across the country, where people become resilient to provocations from other people, people raising racist issues and so on. We have to quell that immediately. We cannot tolerate racism from any quarters. And that should be quelled immediately. And it can be done if all of us begin to change our mindsets and begin to look upon each other as brothers and sisters. As people, we are South Africans. We don't belong to this race and that race. We don't belong to this religion and that religion. Let us come together as one across those kinds of barriers. Then only are we going to be able to resist provocation of that kind. And if you look at Rwanda, it didn't take them long for one provocation to raise that issue, and it went right across the country.
Thank you, Ella.
Yeah.
I'm in conclusion now. I'm going to, before I thank our panel, just ask Aslam and Jamia to have some final comments about the way they thought the conversation went, and maybe some concluding remarks. Aslam? I know I'm catching you off guard, but I'm hoping that
You're on mute, Aslam. Yeah.
You're muted.
No, thank you very much, Rashid. There were one or two other questions that came up that I thought needed to be answered, but you want to end. Okay. So for me, what I picked up on all the comments, and as well as some, is that there is a serious moment of description that is required, and a serious moment of contemplating our own, I don't want to call it culpability, but our own responsibility with regard to understanding the issue, and with regard to stepping up and addressing the issue, and becoming part of the solution. Secondly, I think that in the space of activities to foster social cohesion, there is a very important conversation about, firstly, how you pick up the pieces, how you generate trust amongst people, because that's obviously what suffered. And thirdly, how you launch a set of conversations, a set of activities, and a set of long-term measures to begin to generate trust. And that is a very important issue that came up from almost everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aslam. Jamia, over to you.
Salam. I think I'm just, you asked how we felt the conversation went, and I think what has struck me throughout, both from the panelists' presentations and responses and the chats, is still the almost how we remain kind of stuck with these different views. The people that are contesting what Rebecca's saying from her interviews on the ground, the people who are living in the area who are saying that's not the way things were. And so this whole thing of I think Aslam put it right at the beginning, what really happened, and not only in Phoenix, in other spaces as well. The fact that we're having a webinar more than a month afterwards, still asking this question and trying to figure it all out, speaks to the complexity of what is unfolded, and I think has left me a little bit almost, despondent in the sense that the task ahead just seems so huge, because how do we even begin to tackle some of the things that both Imran, Ella, Sbu especially have pointed to? How do we even get to a place beyond this, where not only do we take the lessons learned, but actually take it forward into producing something different, transforming our society? Where do we even begin? And I think that they, like Aslam says, if it's a moment of introspection, that's fine. But how are we going to move forward from this point?
Thank you very much, Jamia, and thank you to our panelists. Sincere thanks from us to all of you, to Rebecca, Sbu, Imran, Ella, Aslam, and Jamia. It was a wonderful conversation. I just want to quote someone at the end now. I was looking for some words, and I found it in the chat. So thanks to the chat. It's been really wonderful. Someone saying, and I quote, "There are still some very raw and open wounds from the nightmare we have just woken up from. I hope these can continue, these conversations can continue in a gentle and a compassionate manner." What a wonderful way that someone just concluded our discussion. Thank you also to Lutfi behind the scenes for the technology and so on. And most of all, thank you to our participants for their wonderful participation. We hope this will be, one of many, many conversations that needs to be had by us in civil society for deep introspection as to what is needed for us to do, and perhaps a wake-up call that we need to work much, much harder in order to mitigate the structural violence that is beneath all of our communities, not only in Phoenix, but everywhere where we are across this country. That can, through a trigger, emerge to the surface, and then we say, where did it come from? It's right there in our eyes. So thank you very much to everyone, and I wish you a good evening further, and thank you again from on the Claremont Main Road Mosque. Jamia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wondered whether there were people who were keen to put on cameras for us to take a screenshot at the end. It's short notice, but perhaps we can get a few more faces and take a little screenshot.
Okay, there you have it. If you would like to put on your cameras,
and maybe give us a wave,
and then we can take a photograph. Can we move and do that quickly? Thank you so much for your patience with us. Right. I have a big wave, Jamia.
There are 3 pages of pictures, but I'll just take the video page. Okay, 1, 2, go.
No one else is waving on me. Thank you, Ella. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. I wish we could also get you to visit Cape Town, but it will happen soon. We pray that this pandemic will leave us sooner rather than later. We're really tired of it. Bye, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Imran.
Bye.
Thank you, Buta Jawa. It's way past your bedtime and you...
No, it's not past my bedtime. It's all right. It's
stimulated there.
Yeah, okay.